Hello, and welcome to the August wrap-up. This is gonna be a big one. So, the story of August is that I got sick, and I was out of work for 3 weeks. And obviously I felt like garbage, and I ended up in the hospital also, and it sucked. But I also had more time to read, because like, what the hell else was I gonna do? I was basically capable of reading, watching YouTube videos, and lying around. So I read a lot, and I actually read a whole stack of stuff that I own, plus several library books. So like, we're gonna go through this, and it's gonna take a minute. So why don't we start, let's just go in order. And we're gonna start with a book that I mostly read in July. Big fat fucking book, but I finished it on the 1st of August, so we're talking about it here. And that is The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. This thing is almost 1,000 pages long. But I don't know, it only took me half a month to read it. What's that, like a couple of weeks? It was quite good. Like, all right, so this is historical fiction, and the main premise is that it's about the building of a cathedral in a town in England. It focuses on a number of different people who are involved in this, and it takes place over the course of like, I want to say 50 years, roughly. It's not just about building the cathedral, you know, it's about all of this, like, there's this civil war going on. My grasp of English history is, you know, it could be better. So I'm not sure what they call this war, but it's the one where the king's son dies in a boat sinking, and then he's like, okay, my heir is my daughter Maud, and then when he died, everyone was like, we didn't like that, and this other guy calls himself king. Oh, my battery's dying, amazing. And gets himself crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and then Maud is like, excuse me, bitch. And there's a whole war over it, and it pissed me off because they kept calling Maud's people the rebels, and I was like, but she's supposed to be queen. I mean, fuck the monarchy, but like, she's not the rebel. Anyway, that one. And so there's a lot of stuff about that. And of course that causes a lot of disruption and different shifting alliances. And then like, there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of personal drama. There are several on-page rape scenes. So like, that's something I think worth mentioning, just because like, maybe you won't want to read it now. But I thought it was quite good. Like, it really kept me into the drama. I did not care about all the characters that much, but eventually, well, I didn't care about Tom, basically, the Mason. But eventually we got past him being in a lot of it, and like, there were other characters we were paying a lot more attention to, and I liked them. And yeah, the rising and falling fortunes of these different characters, and also just all of the effort that went into funding the building of this cathedral, like, or even just the maintenance of a monastery, and then the building of the cathedral on top of that. Really interesting, not something I knew a lot about, and it was interesting to read about the period of medieval Britain, you know, and it's again not something that I know a ton about, and I felt like he did a lot of research in writing this. It is the beginning of a trilogy, and I am going to continue the trilogy at some point. All right, I have charged the battery, so let's talk about the other books. Also, I didn't mention, I read 10 books this month. Like, for me, that is a lot. That is actually the most books I've read in a month since I started like paying attention to how many books I read in a month. So don't expect a repeat. All right, next book, we're gonna talk The Leper of St. Giles by Ellis Peters, which is the 5th book of the Chronicles of Brother Cadfael. So this one I actually, a little embarrassingly, I started it back in like fucking May, I want to say. Yeah, in May. And then I just didn't read it for like 3 months. But August afforded me the opportunity to be like, here's a book I'm partially into that is also in my house. So I'm going to read it. I'm going to finish it. It was enjoyable. Also kind of, it's funny because it's set at like the same time as part of the Pillars of the Earth, and that same civil war is happening in England. It's just kind of at the beginning of it. And it doesn't really affect what's going on in this book that much, but it has affected other books. And I just think it's a really interesting time period to be setting something. Plus, it's also set, you know, Cadfael is a monk, and like, I think that's the correct term. I'm not Catholic enough to really understand the distinctions, but he's a monk who lives at an abbey. Yes. And yeah, I don't know. It's just parallels, the similarities. Of course, the books are very different, but so these are murder mysteries. And in this one, a wedding is going to be taking place at the abbey, and it's between this rich older man and this young woman. She's like 18. She like has come into a lot of money from her father, like a lot of land actually, really. And it seems pretty clear that this is kind of a manipulation on the part of her aunt and uncle who have been looking after her. It's not a great thing. She clearly doesn't want to actually marry this guy, but she's in a position where she has to. And then naturally, like, he has several like squires or whatever who work for him, and one of them is in love with her, and then he turns up dead, and then, you know, not the guy who's in love with her, the guy she's supposed to marry. And there's drama, and Cadfael is like poking his nose in. So yeah, and the lepers are because there's a leper colony close by at this place called St. Giles, and it's like just outside town, I guess, up the road from the abbey. Frustratingly not included on the map at the beginning of this book. There are several maps, and I was like, well, why don't they show you where St. Giles is? Like, this is the whole abbey, kind of where things are. This is the town and where the abbey is relative to the town of Shrewsbury. And I was just like, why isn't St. Giles on there? But whatever. You know, and like one of the guy who is accused of the murder is hiding at the leper colony, and like there's some interesting stuff about them and about a specific leper who's there as well. It's a good book. You know, I mean, I'm continue reading the series. It wasn't like, I don't think it was my favorite. I didn't find it as exciting as some of the others, but still, it was a good mystery, and I enjoyed that. Next, another mystery. Motherless Brooklyn by Jonathan Lethem. So this one is in my possession because I'm not great at buying Christmas presents, so a lot of times I'll just be like, hello parents, here are some books. And they read a lot, so it's fair. And this I bought for my mom. So she read it a couple years ago, and then she just gave it to me because that's what happens to the books I give her if they are mysteries, which they basically always are. So I have a handful of other books that she's returned to me in that fashion. And I decided that it was time to read this one because she's short and it's an interesting idea. So this is kind of a, you know, kind of a mystery thriller about a guy with Tourette's, which is pretty relevant to the story because it really affects like how he interacts with people and also how he thinks, and it makes him very interesting. And this guy basically, like, from about 13 was taken under the wing of this small-time gangster who was trying to kind of build himself up. And he got a group of boys from this orphanage, and they have been working for him ever since. They're now, you know, full-ass adults and everything, and it's been years. And the plot kicks off when he's murdered, this guy, this gangster. And the thing about Lionel Esrog, the main character here, is he doesn't have a lot of knowledge of the workings of this group. He doesn't even seem to fully understand that they are in a gang. Like, that they are sort of working for the mob. Like, I don't know how much of that he really has understood because he's been kept out of, like, the loop of really any information about anything. He just does specifically what he's told to do, which oftentimes is driving the car or listening to wiretaps, because he has a very good like memory, and also like if someone says this key phrase, do this, he's very good at picking up on these things. So after this guy's murdered, he decides that he's going to figure out who did it, and so he starts digging into what's really been going on and this mysterious like bosses that they have they're not allowed to talk about, and some other weird stuff happening around a Buddhist, not temple. There's a word for it that I do not remember because it was a few weeks ago that I read this. But anyway, there's some shady Buddhists. I don't know. There's some weird stuff. There's several different angles of like mobsters from different places. And it was a good book. It really was. Like a lot of very much set in its place in a very specific part of Brooklyn. And the character's very just like really, he's an interesting guy to follow. Not just because of what he's done in his life and how his life has been, and because of how his brain works and because of how he like conceptualizes that, I guess, over time. And good book. Apparently there's a movie. This was recent, right? Which is why I have this like movie edition from a couple of years ago. 2019 apparently was this movie, I guess. It stars Edward Norton. Not sure if I'm gonna watch it or not, just because it feels like something that would be difficult to adapt, not insofar as the actions of the plot, but insofar as the character. And like, I don't know if I want to watch him pretending to have Tourette's for, you know, 2 hours. Like, that would also be a little weird. But recommend. Good book. Now who's next? Who's next? I believe the next book, Loveless by Alice Oseman. So this was a library book. Boop. This is something that made its way onto my list of things to read, because as with most young adult, if it makes its way onto that list, it's because there's some queer protagonist I want to read about. And this one, Loveless, was like, it's the only Alice Oseman I've ever read. I don't know that I'm going to read any of her other books, but this one is about an aromantic asexual girl who is just started college and really wants to fall in love. And like, she is a lot. I enjoyed the book though. You know, for all that it's a contemporary, and for all that it's a little obvious that it's basically about Alice Oseman. Like, listen, I don't know how many of the things happening in this book actually were like things that happened to her, but the girl goes to the exact same university she did, so that's a little on the nose. I mean, sure, if I were gonna write a contemporary about someone going to school, they would go to the same school as me, but I would at least give it a different name and put it in a different town, you know? So we could pretend. I wouldn't just be like, yeah, and then she went to this specific small private, you know, liberal arts college in Iowa. I would be like, no, it was another one and it was in Minnesota. Now you don't know it's me. It's hidden in secret now. Anyway, I know it wouldn't work, but at least you could pretend. So anywho, there's a lot of focus on her friends, on her relationships with like her identity as that evolves, and on Shakespeare, because they're trying to have, and this was funny to me because it was like they like acting, her and her friends, and so they want to do a Shakespeare play, but then the Shakespeare like club, the specific, because there's a bunch of different little theater clubs, and the Shakespeare club didn't have enough people, so they didn't have one this year, and I'm like, what the fuck? That just doesn't seem realistic to me, but what do I know? So then they kind of form their own, and so there's a lot about like them working on rehearsing for this thing, like they're doing a series of scenes instead of a whole play. I liked it, honestly. Like, there was other queer representation besides her being aro-ace. There was a lot of angst about it, which I do enjoy. I like to read books where they're asexual aromantic characters who are happy with themselves, but the angst, okay, I like the angst because it's realistic, because it's relatable in some ways. I mean, I was definitely never a person who was like, ooh, I really want to fall in love. Like, I've never given a shit, but like, there were still little parts of it that were like, yeah, I feel that, you know? But she figures it all out in the end, and it's pretty good. It's pretty good. I'm sitting like this because otherwise the windows are reflecting on my glasses. Like, okay. So yeah, that was pretty good, you know, for a young adult book. Okay, what's next? Ah, yes. We must talk about one of my favorite books. And it's so hard to talk about, but The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. So this was my, okay. So I was in the hospital, like I said, for several days, and this was my hospital book. I asked my sister to bring it because I was like, I know I own it, I know it's easy to find on the bookshelf, and you know what, I love it, so let's just read it again, it's time. This book, oh my god, this book is hard to pitch, I think, because it's so good. It's so good, but like, not even for plot reasons, it's just good. Like, I feel like anyone who's read this book probably completely understands what I'm trying to say. Like, it's just good. Okay, sorry. Basically, it's about a scientist who lives on a moon in this anarchist colony that's existed for about, I want to say, 200 years at this point. And they have a very specific way of living their lives. And unfortunately, not a lot of higher level physics. And that's what he's into. And he has an idea that will like a physics idea that's going to revolutionize really everything. But he doesn't want it to only, like, nobody is appreciating where he's from. He doesn't want it to only be given to one group of people for them to exploit. He wants other physicists to talk to. Anyway, so he decides to go to the planet that these colonists are originally from, that the moon orbits, right? Which is something that no one ever does. So that the book kind of goes back and forth between the present day, where he is on that planet, being culture shocked constantly and trying to figure out like what it is they want from him and what he is going to be able to do there, versus the past of his sort of life story, growing up and etc. on his own world. So there's a lot of fascinating contrast between the way people live on these two worlds, and that's like the meat of this, I think, is exploring these different philosophies and like the positives and the negatives of both of them. And then towards the end, he comes into contact with the ambassador from Earth, and we learn some about like what Earth is like in the future and their perspective on the difference between these two places. It's absolutely fantastic. Like, I cannot recommend this book enough. And look, does a ton happen in it? Is there a lot of action? Not really. There's some, but it's just one of those sci-fi books where it's all about the world building, the philosophy, the characters, which typical of Ursula K. Le Guin, I think. And so I absolutely fucking adore this book. Also, this cover is stunning. It's stunning. I bought this at a used bookstore in, I think, Normal, Illinois. I mean, I knew it was, you know, Ursula K. Le Guin, love her. Didn't really know what the book was about at all. Didn't care, because holy shit, look at this cover. Anyway, okay. Please read The Dispossessed if you love yourself. Next, we're gonna talk about a big fat boy, American Eden. David Hossack, David Hossack, Botany and Medicine in the Garden of the Early Republic by Victoria Johnson. So this is a nonfiction, obviously. And this is something I've been meaning to read for a couple of years. I got it for Christmas a couple years ago, and you know, I always feel a little bit guilty about not reading my Christmas books a little quicker, so picked this one up. Read it in like 3 days because that's literally all I was doing. I was just like sitting here reading. And this cover is, I just think, really quite beautiful. This is a drawing of this garden that he started. So, okay, let's get into this. So basically, David Hossack was a teenager when the American Revolution happened. So that just gives you an idea of the timeline. And his interests were in botany and medicine, and also very much in how learning more about botany and in cultivating more native plants and studying them, like native to North America, would lead to medical solutions, right? So he went and he trained in London and in Edinburgh as a doctor. He learned from botanists and botanic garden like runners, people in Europe, and he tried to bring a lot of this to New York, which is where he was from. And with, I think ultimately with success. The thing that didn't really succeed was his garden. He really had this dream of having this botanic garden in Manhattan, which he did buy land for. He did build it and did maintain it, but only for a short period of time. It's like quite expensive to maintain something like that. And the government would just never give him any money. And ultimately, when they kind of agreed to, it ended up in the hands of Cambridge, kind of ended up owning, not Cambridge, Columbia ended up owning the land ultimately, and then and then the guy who was supposed to be looking after it like stole a bunch of the exotic plants and sold them, and he fucking sucked. And like that was a whole mess. So it ended up ultimately falling apart, which really sucks. But I think that David Hosack's like actual legacy was much deeper than that, in like getting America to care, and doctors in America to care about botany, and to care about like those types of medicines. And I would say that his legacy really does include like all the, like the botanical gardens that do exist in America, and the increasing interest that people did have over the course of his life and afterwards in native plants and in growing plants and in having gardens. Like Europe was very into that stuff, and America just like wasn't. I mean, I think we were kind of busy and just didn't have the resources in a lot of ways. But as people got richer, and as there were more people, and as, you know, as things evolved, Americans got more into that. And also, a fun fact, the Elgin Garden, which is, he called it Elgin after a town in Scotland where his family was from, the land actually is where 30 Rock is today. And Columbia made a lot of money off of selling that land later. So good for them, I guess. And it's a Columbia because he did work at Columbia for a time as a doctor, like as a teacher of the medical school. Yeah, and he knew like everybody. And famously, I guess I'll mention this, even though it's like just one small part of his life, he was the doctor that Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton had at the ready for their duel. He was friends with both of them. He was close with both of them. Even after Hamilton died, he still communicated with Burr. Burr did have a lot of interest in botany as well. Hamilton had some as well. You know, it's just a lot of founding fathers type and famous people of the time who were connected with Hosack. Like everybody knew him. It's interesting that he's kind of slipped through the cracks of history. But it was a very interesting book. So I'm glad I read it. Who's next? Haha. All right. Okay, so then I got a library book. Okay, and this book, how do we explain this book? It's called Dreamers of the Day by Mary Doria Russell. So first of all, we know I love her. We know I love Mary Doria Russell because she wrote The Sparrow, and I think it's like one of the best books I read this year. But she only really wrote those 2 sci-fi books, that little duology, as far as I can tell. Historical fiction was more her milieu. And Dreamers of the Day is a book I knew I needed to read the moment I knew it existed, because T.E. Lawrence is in it. And I'm embarrassing. So, my friend alerted me to the fact this book exists, and I was like, holy shit. This book is weird, all right? So basically, it's historical fiction. It's set in the 1920s, and it's kind of this self-actualization story about this almost middle-aged woman. I forget how old she is. I guess in her 40s, who comes into quite a bit of money because her whole family dies of the flu, right, during the pandemic. And sad, but she inherits a bunch of money, and she decides to remake herself somewhat. And she decides almost on a whim, I'm gonna go to Egypt. That's gonna be my thing. I'm gonna go to Egypt, have a trip there, see some of the world. And she has a bit of a connection to the area because her sister lived in, I want to say near Jerusalem at least, for several years. Her husband was working there. I forget what he was doing. But, you know, she did a bit of missionary type work, or like charitable type work while she was there. You know, and so also Ms. Main character wants to, whose name I have forgotten, oops, wants to connect to that as well. So anyways, Jesus, I'm taking too long to explain this. She goes to Cairo. She ends up meeting several of these famous people and getting kind of involved in some of their discussions. So basically what was happening at this very specific time was that the imperial empires were drawing lines in the Middle East. They were deciding where the countries were going to be. We're going to invent countries. We're going to just pull countries out of the hat. We're going to be like, here's Iraq. That's a new thing. Here's Iran. Did they make Iran? I don't know. Here's Jordan. What is Jordan? I don't know. They made it up. Anyway, so they were like, and who's going to be in charge of what and all that crap. So Winston Churchill is here. Before he was like perhaps internationally famous, at least she's like, she doesn't even know who he is really. Gertrude Bell was there. I didn't love the way she was written. Maybe, I mean, it's probably accurate to personality, and Gertrude Bell definitely was like weirdly sexist for a woman who achieved a lot of amazing things. So that kind of sucks. She was against suffrage. I'm like, what the fuck? Anyway, and T.E. Lawrence, of course. And her connection to Lawrence, she has a little bit more of a connection to Lawrence because basically the idea is that like 10 years previously when he was a student and he was learning Arabic, he learned it not from her sister, but from people her sister knew. So he knew her sister. So she's like heard of him. And in that context before he became famous. But, so he shows her around a little bit. She also has, what's really the bulk of the book is that she has this romance with this German guy who might be a spy. And that's fun. And honestly, I admire Russell for writing something that's just like this. Like, I love that she wrote this book because it's so fucking niche. And I enjoyed it. Like, I had a great time reading it. What can I say? Well, let's just talk, I guess. Her portrayal of T.E. Lawrence, I enjoyed, honestly. Like, I think that it's hard to get a great portrayal of him because of Lawrence of Arabia, because that movie is so fucking good that I think a lot of people would automatically be like, yeah, that is what T.E. Lawrence was like. And it's not really at all. So, I mean, it's my favorite movie pretty much, but like, it is not what he is like in this book. He is like an actual person in this book, and enjoyably. There was a couple bits where I was like, what? Okay. But for the most part, I liked him in this book, and I liked seeing him in this book. Also, sorry, this book gets weird by the end because you realize partway through that she's actually narrating it from beyond the grave. And then in the last couple, like, the last like chunk of the book, I guess, like the last chapters, she's just straight up dead. And she talks about stuff that happened after her death regarding some of these figures, and also about how, okay, so weird. Basically, like, there's this idea that if you drink from the Nile, you will eventually return there. And I guess not necessarily in your lifetime, because it's basically, she finds herself in kind of the ghost Nile, and she's with all these other people, and some of them are like famous people who famously at some point interacted with the Nile River. Napoleon is there. St. Francis of Assisi. I don't fucking know. And I kinda, it's batshit, and I kinda love it. So she gets to give that perspective of herself and a few of these other historical figures on like modern history, and this book is nuts, but I really enjoyed it. Okay. Oh boy. Let's talk about, we've only got a few left, Upright Women Wanted by Sarah Gailey. Okay, so this is a super short little novella that I've been curious about, well, I guess for 2 years because it's from 2020. It's essentially a Western. It's very queer, and it's kind of dystopian society, like basically everything is very misogynist and people are information is very much at like a premium. Like there's like, you know, government departments that are like, these are the informations you're allowed to have, these are the prescribed correct books, and they have people called librarians who travel between all these different towns and actually distribute that kind of material. But it turns out that some of these librarians are part of a little rebellion, and they move people about sometimes, and they move restricted secret materials, and some of them are queer. So this young woman whose girlfriend has been hanged, she sneaks away with the librarians and she joins them. And so then it's just kind of like, it's a Western. There are some shootouts. There's a lot of traveling across the inhospitable American Southwest. They're heading towards Utah. I was amused that Utah is like this, has this kind of like independent community, and that's where kind of like the rebellion has a center. I'm like, Utah? What happened to the Mormons? Because like, they'd be on top of all this bullshit. So where'd they go? But I don't know. That's just me being mean, I guess. It was a good book. It really was. Short and sweet and queer, and the characters were all a little bit dicks, which is fun for, I guess, for a Western. It was a thing where I'm like, I wish they'd be a little nicer to this girl, because like, what the fuck does she know of the world? Like, just treat her a little more gently, but fucking whatever. Okay. Now we have to talk about a book I didn't really like. First Women by Kate Anderson Bauer. This is a nonfiction, and it's about the first ladies from Jackie Kennedy to Michelle Obama. The 2016 election was like taking place while this book was, I guess, being written when it was published. So there are references to the fact that Hillary Clinton is running for president, obviously, because like they talk about her because she was the first lady. I did not like this book very much. Number one, it bounced around far too much. Like, it sometimes felt like stream of consciousness while we were moving from one woman to another, one topic to another. I think it could settle down during some chapters, and that I appreciated. I liked it when we could talk for an extended period of time about like, okay, say assassination attempts. That's the topic for this chapter. Like, that's nice. But otherwise, there was just so much bouncing between topics. If I stopped listening for a couple, like for a minute, because I was like driving, and then I would be like, wait, who the fuck are we talking about? What are we talking about? What is going on? And I don't think that's great. I also wish there had been more, maybe a bit more biographical material about these women. It was in there, but you had to wait for it, because again, the attention span of this book, not great. I was just like, can we start at the beginning? I'm not saying we have to go, this is the chapter on Jackie Kennedy and only Jackie Kennedy, you know, because fine, they all knew each other, of course. So there's a lot of stuff about their relationships. So I get it. But like, I would have just liked to kind of start being like, okay, we're going to talk about where they're all from, you know, what kind of jobs they had, how they met their husbands, like their, I don't know, other affiliations. I don't think they ever told me where Jackie Kennedy is from. I think the answer is Boston. And I know our family was rich. But like, that shit that I'm not sure this book actually told me. And like, eventually, like, we got some of that, but I wanted it as context, maybe at the beginning, and that is not what we got. And then like, listen, I knew going in that this was probably going to be the kind of book that doesn't really dig in and examine, and it wasn't really. And by that I mean like, can we talk about like, I don't know, can we just like dig a little further into the differences between them maybe? I mean, like, if we're gonna say, I'm not gonna do a good job describing this, but like, I guess it was a little bit too, maybe the book wasn't political enough for me. Maybe that's the thing. And it's not like I'm gonna be out here being like, if you're married to someone with shit politics, you're a shit person. I don't think that's true. I don't think it's the, say, job of Laura Bush to get her husband to behave, okay? It's not. It's his job to not be shit, right? As with any of them. So that's not what I mean by politics. I mean like the political, I don't know, social fucking justice, I don't know, realities of who becomes a first lady, who becomes president, the like class things about it. I'm not describing this well, but maybe you get what I'm trying to say that it didn't dig into. I don't know. I just kind of sometimes would be like, but dude, what are the implications of that? Or can we talk for a minute about like why you think that might be for such and such a thing? Like, I don't know. What's an attempt? What can I attempt? Like, maybe dig a little into why does Michelle Obama seem to have really disliked, at least according to this book, being a first lady? The fact that she doesn't have connections to a lot of these people. Well, why is that? You know? Can we talk about it? Not really, apparently not. Listen, clearly the woman who wrote this did a lot of interviewing, a lot of reading. There is a lot of like quotes from different people who've worked in the White House, from letters between these women. It's interesting. And I think I learned, like, on some level, quite a bit. I didn't really, like, for example, ever really think about the fact that obviously these women would cultivate relationships with each other, which stretched over decades, you know, after they were done being first ladies, after their husbands were dead, like just through time. And some of them were like really quite interesting people. I think, you know, and talking about the things that they achieved and their own kind of agendas, the things that they kind of focused on. Like if you look, I mean, for example, Betty Ford and, you know, dealing with addiction, and that's all very interesting. But I had my criticisms. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend this book. It's like really hard to, can we just focus on a topic, please? And like they would jump through time a lot too, obviously, and I found that just kind of confusing sometimes. All right, I'm almost done. I think I only have one left. Yeah, I only have one book left. And we're gonna talk about Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang. So this is a series of short stories. Short story collection of things written in the 90s and early noughts by Ted Chiang. Why did I say it like that? And I have heard, and all the quotes on here make it sound like he's absolutely amazing. And listen, he had some good ideas, I think. And like he explains in the back a little bit about where these stories come from in his mind, like mathematical principles that he read about and thought were fascinating, things in physics, and like they're incorporated into these stories of like, and I get it. I just didn't really connect with a lot of them. I just didn't, and they weren't bad, but I guess what I was hoping for, a few years ago I read The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories by Ken Liu, and I was blown away, absolutely obsessed. Really need to read his second collection of short stories, I just haven't because I suck. And what the difference is between that and this, I couldn't tell you, but that was what I was hoping for. Like that was the lyrical writing, that was just like the really like interesting ideas. I don't know, and then this just like left me cold. It wasn't bad. Of course, the titular Story of Your Life, the movie Arrival was based on that, and that's a beautiful movie. The story was good. I think that I might have had a different feelings about it, like if I hadn't already seen the movie, and so I kind of knew what was going to happen, but I did like the story. The Evolution, no. 72 Letters, that one was interesting because he combines these concepts of like, okay, what if golems like were real and worked, and people actually built them and they became an industry of these automated like things. Plus also the weird, I think Victorian, slightly pre-Victorian like idea where they were trying to figure out how reproduction worked, and they had this idea essentially that the sperm contains a homunculus, so basically a tiny human being, and the contact with the egg is what gives it kind of vitality and features apparently, and the ability to like live and grow, but all of the other information is contained within the sperm. So they're like, okay, well, what if you could make them bigger? What if you could like harvest the sperms within the homunculus? Because that's where the theory is insane, right? Because like if every sperm contains a little dude, then that little dude has to also contain sperms which contain even littler dudes. And it's turtles all the way down. It's insane. That is not how anything works, of course, and it doesn't make any sense, and that should have alerted people. But anyway, it's like, what if that actually was how things work? What if that actually was? And that's an interesting idea. I think just like I didn't really connect to any of the stories, but the ideas were interesting. Like in the first one, Tower of Babylon, it's like actually about these guys building that Tower of Babel from the Bible. And you know, like how does that work? It's incredibly tall. It is incredibly tall. And how are they building it at this particular time period with their technology? And like, it's about this guy who is a miner, I think, and he and his men are hired to actually climb up to the very top and to get busy with chipping their way into heaven, because I don't know, there's like a ceiling. It's pretty wild. Or Division by Zero, where the idea is that this woman, mathematician, discovers that math is not consistent. And she's like, well, time to die. Like it's, you know, just the entire underpinning of everything. But also how her husband kind of like interacts with that, because he's not a mathematician, so he sees it from kind of a different perspective. So, you know, I mean, I'm not saying don't read this. Just, it wasn't quite exactly what I want from sci-fi short stories, I guess, but it was not bad. And you know what? Obviously, like I've said, there were some very cool ideas in this. And that's it. That's all 10 fucking books. Yes, it is. I talked about them all. And, wow, I'm tired. Yeah, don't expect another list for a month to be this long again, because boy, I mean, I had a lot of time and I was reading some quite short books in some of these cases. So yeah, 10 is not achievable on a normal basis, but I did it and I'm done, and it was a good reading month.